Absolutely. We've got a lot to talk about today, so let's get right to it. First off, I want to acknowledge the tragic plane crash that occurred in Australia that took the lives of 5 individuals, including 4 Americans. The President's thoughts and prayers are with the families of the victims, and the U.S. Embassy and Consulate are ready to provide necessary and appropriate assistance. Moving on, the President was honored to announce that Lieutenant General McMaster will be his national security advisor. General McMaster served his nation in the United States Army for over 3 decades, including during Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, and Desert Storm. The President met with many distinguished and qualified candidates for the position, and he has said that he will continue to consider many of them for other positions within the administration. He is especially pleased that Lieutenant General Kellogg will stay on as the National Security Council Chief of Staff. The President is proud to welcome General McMaster to the team. We have full authority to structure the office to his desires to best serve its ultimate mission, which is to protect the American interests at home and abroad. This morning, Secretary Kelly and the Department of Homeland Security released memos regarding the implementation of 2 of the President's executive orders that are designed to protect the homeland. These 2 memos provide explicit guidance to DHS staff on how to carry out 2 executive orders signed by the President on January 25th, one dealing with interior enforcement and one dealing with border security. Perhaps most critically, the President is empowering DHS to carry out the immigration laws currently on the books. Of course, DHS gave a full briefing on these memos this morning, but just to briefly summarize a few of the facts. The memo regarding the executive order enhancing public safety in the interior of the United States outlines several practices and policies in order to strengthen the efficient and faithful execution of this country's immigration laws. That includes hiring more ICE agents and officers, as well as additional mission support and legal staff necessary to support their activities. This memo also directs the establishment of the Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement Office within ICE, fulfilling another major campaign promise of the President. This office will facilitate the engagement with victims and their families to ensure that their questions and concerns regarding immigration enforcement efforts are addressed. The memo regarding the executive order Border Security and Immigration Enforcement Improvements outlines the steps that DHS will take to secure the nation's southern border, prevent further illegal immigration, and to repatriate illegal immigrants swiftly, consistently, and humanely. This includes immediately identifying and allocating all sources of available funding for the planning, design, construction, and maintenance of a wall along our southern border, and hiring of additional personnel, including 5,000 additional CBP border agents. Again, I would refer you to DHS for further comment on these specific memos. There are fact sheets and Q&As on the DHS website that address many of the intricacies and areas within each of these executive orders that you might have questions on. Also this weekend, the President had calls with the President of Panama and the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Readouts of those calls have both been provided. The President's team this weekend also had a very productive meeting on the President's plan to repeal and replace Obamacare and ensure that it is replaced with a system that works for all Americans. Back to the President's schedule today. In honor of Black History Month, the President started his day by visiting the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The museum opened last September and has quickly become one of Washington's most visited attractions. The President was joined by a group of individuals that included his daughter Ivanka, Dr. Ben Carson and his wife, Senator Tim Scott, Alveda King, the niece of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Museum Director Lonnie Bunch, Dr. David Skorkin, who was the Secretary of the Smithsonian, and as well as others. The President commented several times during his tour about how impressed he was with the museum. Some of the exhibits that he was particularly drawn to included the section on Harriet Tubman, which featured a shawl that was given to her by Queen Victoria in the late 1800s, the section of the museum that featured the courageous contribution of African Americans that have made to the United States military, and the President was particularly pleased by the Muhammad Ali exhibit with the quote, "I shook up the world," prominently displayed. The President also enjoyed viewing for the first time with Dr. and Mrs. Carson the exhibit dedicated to his extraordinary life. Similarly, Alveda King, who had never viewed the museum's exhibit on her uncle, the President was honored that he was able to share this experience with the two of them specifically. The President further expressed his appreciation for the tour and said he looks forward to returning again. His desire is to honor the immense contributions of courageous African American leaders throughout our history by building a more unified country dedicated to liberty and justice. This afternoon, the President will have a routine classified National Security Council briefing in the Situation Room, in addition to his presidential daily briefing, which he received earlier this morning. Then, this evening, the President will have dinner with the Vice President. I'm sure that they will discuss the Vice President's recent trip to Europe. The Vice President was an incredible representative for our nation and the President during his time, where he reiterated our support for European allies in unified pursuit of the noble ideas of freedom, democracy, and justice, and the rule of law, and discussing how to do more to encourage all NATO allies to meet their financial obligations and commitments. During his speech before the Munich Security Conference on Saturday, the Vice President conveyed the administration's unwavering commitment to Europe's peace and prosperity, especially remembering the tens of thousands of Americans who gave their lives to defend those ideals during both World War I and II. These shared sacrifices are the backbone of our alliance and our mission of security through strength. During his time in Munich, the Vice President also met with 9 world leaders. The Vice President and these leaders discussed the issues most pressing to them, including the escalating violence in eastern Ukraine and the role of NATO in the fight against ISIS. The Vice President also met in Brussels with the President of Vice President Tusk of the Council of European Union and the NATO Secretary General. As a candidate for office, President Trump actually called attention repeatedly to the fact that for too long, many of our other NATO allies have not been sharing the financial burden. The President looks forward to working closely with NATO to advance our shared objectives. A strong NATO means a safer world, and the United States looks forward to working with our partners in NATO to achieve just that. Looking ahead to the President's upcoming schedule, tomorrow he'll meet with Secretary of State Tillerson, fresh off his trip to Germany for the G20 Foreign Ministers Summit. They'll discuss the President's foreign policy agenda and the Secretary's upcoming trip to Mexico. Thursday morning, he'll have a listening session regarding job creation in the manufacturing sector with CEOs and business leaders from different industries. On Friday, he'll deliver remarks to the Conservative Political Action Conference, and we are just 1 week out today from the President's joint address to Congress. The President will continue to work closely with his team to craft a speech that lays out his ambitious policy agenda that will benefit all Americans. Plans are currently in the works for pre- and post-address activities for the President and his staff, and we'll have more updates as the week goes on. Before I take your questions, I want to address the recent threats and acts of vandalism on Jewish community centers throughout the country. The President said this morning, I just want to reiterate, quote, "The anti-Semitic threats targeting our Jewish community centers are horrible and painful, and a very sad reminder of the work that we must do, the work that must be done to root out hate and prejudice and evil." With that, take some of your questions. Jim Stenson.
Sean?
Yeah.
Sean, thank you. I was curious if the President regrets or wants to clarify his characterization, by the way, I have 2 questions, of the media as an enemy of the American people.
I think the President has been very clear that certain outlets have gone out of their way to not represent his record accurately, and it is a concern to him. And I think some reporters, he has deep respect for the First Amendment, for the role of the press. I've addressed this multiple times in the past. He has a healthy respect for the press, but I think that it's a two-way street, as I've also said before, and I think that the President understands that certain outlets have gone out of their way to not be completely accurate and fair in their coverage of what's going on.
Speaking of the media, I've noticed 2 times in the last week that you've been directly contradicted by 2 members of the media, one of them Bill Maher of HBO, who said that in front of guests at Mar-a-Lago, the President was briefed on the classified North Korean situation.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
The President and the Prime Minister of Japan were briefed in front of guests.
No, I didn't say that.
No. This is what was being said on HBO, that the President and the Prime Minister were briefed on classified information in front of guests at Mar-a-Lago. I just want to clarify, did that happen?
No.
Or did they go to this guest?
No, I think I walked through this timeline before, Jim, and it's amazing. A photo gets put out, the President's got a piece of paper, and the immediate conclusion is he's got to be talking about classified information. The President was briefed on the situation in North Korea prior to the dinner in a skiff that's at Mar-a-Lago. He went and had dinner. He discussed the logistics of the press conference, which I've talked to you all about before. There was a question as to where to hold the press conference. They had a discussion about the logistics of it, and subsequent to that dinner, he was briefed again in a skiff with updates on the situation in North Korea. That's it, plain and simple. But to your first question, I think that it's amazing that the immediate jump of conclusion to several outlets was, well, there's a piece of paper, it must be classified. I don't, it's amazing to see that, and to see people jump to that conclusion that he's surrounded by his staff and members of the Japanese delegation. The conclusion is they must be doing something nefarious or wrong. In fact, he followed every procedure that's laid out. And I think in some cases it's disheartening to realize that those are the kind of immediate conclusions that somebody jumps to. So, when you talk about coverage, we have a free press. We have the right for people to say and do what they believe. But at some point, it is incumbent upon people to try to get it right. And in that case, it wasn't even an attempted. It was a jump to conclusion by many to say that there must be something else going on, when in fact we were able to provide a very, very clear tick-tock as to far as what had happened. And that, Jessica.
John, question about the resignation of the 10 people off the Asian American Council.
Right.
That happened last week, and in the letter they said in part, we can no longer serve a president whose policies aim to create outcomes that are diametrically opposite to our principles, goals, and charge. First of all, what's the White House's reaction, and do you plan to appoint your own members to this council?
Yeah, those members of that council were political appointees of the Obama administration. Their terms were set to expire this year. So it's not surprising in the sense that they were appointees of Barack Obama. They were going to have their terms expire. But I get it, but most political appointees from other agencies or whatever would automatically resign because of the term of these individuals. They would carry through to later in the year. But I don't think it's surprising that people who were appointed by Barack Obama to fulfill his agenda suddenly understand that there is a new administration in town and didn't want to stay on board. But we will make sure that we appoint people to this task force. It's important. It's something that's provided guidance to multiple presidents in the past, and we will continue to do that. Shannon.
On the statement today about the anti-Semitic acts,
yeah.
What specifically is the president going to do to address that issue? And along those lines, there were reports earlier on that he was considering changing the mandate of this countering violent extremism program to focus just on Islamic extremist groups. Is he still considering that, or would he also leave the scope of the program to also consider?
Are you talking about the travel executive order?
No. This is the countering violent extremism program that.
Yeah, and again, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves there. There's nothing to announce on that front. And secondly, to the first part of your question, I think the president's going to do what he's talked about since election night. It's through deed and action. Talk about how we can unify this country and speak out against, hate, anti-Semitism, racism, and he's going to continue to do that. And I think that he will show you over the course of months and years through what he does in terms of his policies and his speech that he is going to be a president that brings people together, that unites them, and that speaks very, very forcefully against those who are seeking to do hate or to tear people down because of their religion or their gender or the color of their skin. I mean, those are all things that I think the president was clear on. John.
Two questions unrelated, if I could. The next big piece in the immigration profile here at the White House is going to be the new executive order. Is the president confident that this one will pass legal muster? And if he is, what gives him that confidence?
Well, I think I want to be clear that we feel confident that we're still going to prevail on the case, the merits of the case. I think that, as was seen in the case of Massachusetts, once it is fully adjudicated, we will prevail because the authority is granted to the president to do what he has to protect the country. So I feel very, very confident about where we're going to. The second track that he's made very clear as well is that until that occurs, we're going to have a dual track system, and that we're going to make sure that we implement a second executive order that is tailored to achieve the same goals, but in accordance with what the court said. So we've been working very closely with the Department of State, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and the team here at the White House to make sure that the next step achieves the president's goal of protecting the country and does so in a way that recognizes the concerns of the court had until we prevail at a later time. So it's a dual track thing.
Second question. Will this administration send American terror suspects picked up overseas to Guantanamo Bay for interrogation
Yeah,
and
I'm not
prosecution.
I'm not going to discuss that right now. As the president has said very clearly before, we don't telegraph what we're going to do. I think he has made very clear, though, that he believes that Guantanamo Bay does serve a very, very healthy purpose in our national security and making sure that we don't bring terrorists to our seas. But I'm not going to get into what we may or may not do in the future. Again, I'm just not going to mark it.
Sean, I want to give you a chance to respond to something because I think that the president's remarks and your clarification about where he stands on anti-Semitism is clear. But after that statement was made by the president, the Anne Frank Center released a pretty strongly worded one, saying that these remarks, while well received, are a Band-Aid on the cancer within the Trump administration, saying that there is, whether blessed or otherwise, a sense of xenophobia within this administration.
Yeah, I think it's, look, the president has made clear since the day he was elected, and frankly going back through the campaign, that he is someone that seeks to unite this country. He has brought a diverse group of folks into his administration, both in terms of actual positions and people that he has sought the advice of. And I think he has been very forceful with his denunciation of people who seek to attack people because of their hate, because of their religion, because of their gender, because of the color of their skin. And it's something that he's going to continue to fight and make very, very clear that he has no place in this administration. But I think that it's ironic that no matter how many times he talks about this, that it's never good enough. Today, I think, was an unbelievably forceful comment by the president as far as his denunciation of the actions that are currently targeted towards Jewish community centers. But I think that he's been very clear previous to this that he wants to be someone that brings his country together and not divide people, especially in those areas. So I saw that statement. I wish that they had praised the president for his leadership in this area, and I think that hopefully as time continues to go by, they recognize his commitment to civil rights, to voting rights, to equality for all Americans.
Yeah. Sean, on that, the Southern
We're starting
poverty,
early with the two questions.
Sorry, Sean, the Southern Poverty, I think you'll want to respond to this.
Okay.
Southern Poverty Law Center said that the number of anti-Muslim groups in the U.S. has tripled between 2015 and 2016 during the time of the campaign. Is this message within the administration, anti-Semitism is not allowed, xenophobia is not allowed, anti-Muslim sentiment within the administration, has the president been forceful